The air inside the dojo was thick and warm, smelling of clean sweat, disinfectant, and the faint, earthy scent of the tatami mats. It was a sound-rich environment, a steady rhythm of exertion. The sharp thwack of a palm striking a heavy bag, the quick scuffle of bare feet pivoting on canvas, the controlled expulsion of breath that sounded like a hiss. It was a place of focused power, where young, strong bodies moved with a liquid grace that came from hours of repetition. In the center of it all, a knot of young men, all hard muscles and louder laughs, were finishing their warm-up drills. Their leader, a broad-shouldered young man named Mark, threw a training partner down with a loud, playful grunt, earning a round of high-fives and backslaps from his friends. They were the kings of this space, confident in their strength, their movements sharp and aggressive. To them, the dojo was their kingdom, and they were its unchallenged royalty. The door to the street opened with a soft chime. A different kind of energy entered the room. It was a quiet energy, slow and hesitant. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her hand still on the handle, as if she needed its support to remain upright. She was small and thin, her shoulders rounded forward in a gentle stoop. A cascade of pure white hair was pulled back into a neat bun, but a few wisps had escaped to frame a face that was kind, but etched with the deep lines of a long life. She wore a simple pair of dark trousers and a light blouse, clothes that seemed out of place amidst the sea of crisp white GIs. She clutched a worn leather purse to her chest with both hands, her knuckles prominent and her fingers thin and delicate. She blinked slowly, her pale blue eyes adjusting to the indoor light, taking in the scene before her with a look of quiet curiosity. For a moment, the rhythm of the room faltered. A few of the younger students glanced over, their movements slowing as they registered the newcomer. Mark and his friends also stopped their roughhousing. One of them, a lanky guy with a smirk perpetually on his face, nudged Mark with his elbow and jerked his chin in the woman's direction. Mark turned, a confident smirk spreading across his own face as he saw her. He didn't say anything at first, but he exchanged a look with his friends, a look of pure, unadulterated amusement that was almost comical in its transparency. To them, she was a spectacle, a strange bird that had accidentally flown into their gym. They started whispering, their voices low but carrying easily in the lull. "Think she's lost?" the lanky one whispered, not bothering to cover his mouth. "Maybe she thinks the bingo hall is next door," another replied. Stifling a snort of laughter, Mark just shook his head, his eyes raking over the woman's frail frame. "Careful, guys," he said in a loud, exaggerated stage whisper. "Looks like she's a killer. Better not get on her bad side." This broke the dam, and the whole group erupted into a fit of poorly suppressed chuckles. They were trying to be discreet, but their disrespect was as plain as the bright lights overhead. They saw only the surface, the bent back, the shaky hands, the soft face of a grandmother. They saw weakness, and in their world weakness was the ultimate joke. The woman, whose name was Eleanor, seemed completely oblivious to the whispers. Her gaze had found the man at the front of the room, the head instructor, a man in his late 40s with a calm demeanor and a gentle voice. This was Sensei Mike. He had seen the woman enter and had already started walking towards her, his face open and welcoming. He offered her a small, respectful bow, which she returned with a slight, careful nod of her head. His presence created a small bubble of quiet around her, shielding her from the less charitable stares in the room. "Welcome, Sensei," Mike said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "I'm Mike. How can I help you today?" Eleanor took a small breath, her hand still tight on her purse. "I saw the sign," she said, her voice soft and a little raspy, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "About the class. I was wondering if I could watch or maybe try." She said the word try as if it were a question she wasn't sure she was allowed to ask. Mike smiled, a genuine warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. There was no pity in his look, only kindness. "Of course. We are always happy to have new students. You are welcome to join in for the warm-up, and we can take it from there. Just do what you can. Listen to your body. There is no judgment here," said the last part a little louder, his eyes briefly flicking towards Mark and his group. The young men's laughter died instantly, replaced by a sullen, shifty-eyed silence. They turned back to their stretching, pretending they hadn't been doing anything wrong. But the air still crackled with their lingering disrespect. Eleanor gave a grateful nod. She had been so worried about coming. It had taken her weeks to work up the courage to even drive past the building twice before finally parking her car. It felt like stepping into a different world, a world that belonged to the young and the strong. But something had pulled her here, a deep, persistent ache in her heart that felt like a summons. She had to do this. For him, Sensei Mike led her to a quiet corner of the mat and showed her where she could put her purse and her small. Then he clapped his hands to get the class's attention. All right, everyone, let's line up for warm-ups. We're starting with joint rotations, so be mindful of your partners. As the students formed neat lines, Mark and his friends ended up not far from Eleanor. Their whispers started up again, quieter this time, but no less biting. They watched as Eleanor tried to copy the instructor's movements. The class began with simple neck rolls. Mark performed his with an exaggerated fluid motion showing off. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved her head slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might detach from her shoulders. Then came the shoulder circles. Mark's were wide and powerful. Eleanor's were small, her movements stiff and constrained. You could almost hear the creak in her joints from across the room. When it came to hip rotations, Mark's were loose and athletic. Eleanor held onto the wall for support, her feet shuffling as she attempted to sway her hips from side to side. The motion was almost imperceptible. One of Mark's friends mimicked her, holding onto an imaginary wall and doing a comical, shuffling little dance, earning another silent round of snickers from his buddies. But Eleanor didn't see them. Her entire being was focused on Sensei Mike. She was soaking in every word, every instruction. It wasn't just about the movements. It was about the feel of it, all the familiar language of the dojo, the Japanese terms Sensei Mike used for some of the stretches. The formal bow at the beginning and end of a sequence. It was like listening to a song she had forgotten she knew, the melody stirring something deep within her soul. Her body was old and uncooperative, a stranger to her now. But her mind was beginning to remember. The struggle was immense. Her knee, encased in a simple fabric brace, ached with every bend. Her back protested at the slightest twist. A film of sweat formed on her brow, not from exertion, but from the sheer effort of concentration and the frustration of her body's betrayal. She stumbled during a simple leg swing, her balance failing her for a second. A sharp gasp escaped her lips before she caught herself against the wall. A loud, barking laugh from Mark's direction was the response. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Sensei Mike shot him a look that could cut glass, and the laughter immediately choked off, replaced by a cough. The instructor's expression was a clear warning. This was a place of respect, and his tolerance for disrespect was zero. Eleanor felt a brief, hot flush of shame. She wanted to turn around, grab her purse, and walk out. To leave this world of loud, confident youths and return to the quiet safety of her home. But then she closed her eyes for just a moment. She pictured a different face, a younger face with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A man who always told her that the strongest warriors were the ones who knew they were weak. He had always said that Jiu-Jitsu wasn't about being stronger than the other person. It was about being smarter. A strange calm settled over her. The whispers, the laughter, it all faded into the background noise. She opened her eyes, and for just a fleeting second, something shifted. The cloudiness in her pale blue eyes seemed to clear, placed by a glint of something sharp and clear, like the flash of a well-polished blade. It was so quick that anyone not watching closely would have missed it. Mark, busy showing off for his friends, didn't see it. Sensei Mike, however, did. He paused, a curious look on his face, as if he had just seen something unexpected and intriguing. Eleanor pushed herself off the wall. Her back was still stooped, her movements were still slow, but a new determination had settled in her jaw. She squared her shoulders as much as she was able and turned back to face the front, ready for the next instruction. She was no longer just an elderly woman trying a new hobby. She was a student, standing on the mat, ready to learn. And in that moment, she was the most focused person in the entire room. The mockery was still there, hanging in the air like a bad smell, but it no longer mattered. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't leaving until she had found it. Asterisk, the warm-up was over and the energy in the room shifted. The casual, rhythmic movements gave way to a more focused intensity. Sensei Mike gathered the class in the center of the mats, his voice calm and clear as he explained the next part of the lesson. All right, everyone. Time to get a partner. The goal is to move, to maintain position, to feel the flow. This is a light roll, a drill. Remember, this is a practice, not a fight. We protect our partners at all times. A slight murmur went through the students as they began to pair up. The young athletic students quickly found their usual training partners, their movements quick and certain. Eleanor stood by the wall, not quite sure what to do. She watched as people grabbed each other's GIs or shook hands, forming pairs of 2, then 3s, before the final inevitable person was left without a partner. It was, of course, Mark. His friends had all paired up with each other, leaving him standing alone, a look of feigned disappointment on his face. He scanned the room, his eyes skipping over the older, more serious students before landing on Eleanor. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. This was too perfect. An opportunity for entertainment? Looks like it's you and me. Grandma, he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far worse than open mockery. He ambled over to her, his chest puffed out, his walk a lazy swagger. He stopped in front of her and held out a hand, not as an equal, but as if he were helping a small child across the street. Don't worry, he added, winking at his friends who were watching with rapt attention. I'll be gentle. A few of them snickered, and one of them made a clumsy, comical gesture of cradling something precious in his arms. Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. She didn't take it. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod. She was painfully aware of the eyes on them. The entire dojo had slowed down. The other students were trying to focus on their own drills, but their attention kept drifting back to the corner. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Everyone knew this was a bad idea. Everyone but the 2 people involved. Sensei Mike, who was circulating through the pairs, saw the situation forming. He started to make his way over, a concerned look on his face. But he was still a good 10 feet away when Mark clapped his hands together, eager to get the show started. All right, let's go, Mark said, gesturing to the open space on the mat. Let's see what you've got. His tone was light and playful, but the underlying disrespect was a heavy, sour smell in the air. Eleanor moved slowly to the designated spot, her steps careful and deliberate. She lowered herself to her knees, a process that looked painful and difficult. Her knee brace creaked softly as she settled into a seated position. Mark dropped to the mat in one fluid, easy motion, landing opposite her with his legs spread wide in a casual, relaxed posture. He was so confident, so sure of his physical superiority, that he didn't even bother to set up a proper guard. He was completely open, almost mocking her with his vulnerability. Okay, so you just try to... Mark said, waving his hand dismissively. Just try to get a hold of me. Try to control my arms or my lapels. I'll give you a little help. He was talking to her as if she were a child, as if she had no idea what she was doing, and in a way she didn't. Her body was stiff, her mind was clouded with decades of neglect. The techniques she was trying to remember felt like ghost stories, vague and out of reach. Eleanor took a deep breath and reached forward, her hands moving slowly, almost tentatively, towards the lapels of Mark's jeans. Her grip was weak, her fingers having trouble finding purchase on the thick, sturdy cotton. Mark watched her with an amused smirk, letting her get her hands settled. He was playing a role for his audience, the gentle giant, humoring the old lady. For a moment, Eleanor simply held on. She wasn't pulling or pushing. She was just feeling. She could feel the grain of the fabric, the warmth of his body beneath it. She could feel the tension in his arms, the way his weight was distributed. He was solid as a rock, planted firmly and with no intention of moving. He was a wall, and she was a feather trying to push against it. Then Mark decided to make his move. He wanted to show off a bit, to put on a little performance for his friends. With a soft grunt, he shifted his weight and easily broke her grip. He didn't shove her hard, just enough to make her fall backward onto the mat with a soft, undignified little puff. He followed her down, positioning himself over her but not putting his full weight on her. He was holding himself up with one arm, looking down at her with a look of mock concern. "Whoops, you okay there?" he asked loudly. His friends erupted in laughter. It was a perfect, staged bit of physical comedy. The frail old woman, helplessly pinned by the strong young man. Eleanor lay on her back, looking up at him, her face flushed with a mixture of exertion and acute embarrassment. This was even worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just that she was weak. She was a joke. Her body felt heavy and useless. Every part of her wanted to just curl up and disappear. But then, a different feeling started to bubble up beneath the shame. It was a feeling she remembered well from her youth, a feeling of being underestimated, of being dismissed. Her late husband had always told her that this feeling was not a weakness, but a gift. It was the feeling of your opponent underestimating you, and that was when they were at their most vulnerable. She pushed herself back up to a seated position. Her movements a little stronger this time, fueled by a flicker of indignation. Mark led her up, a patronizing smile still on his face. "Let's try again," he said, as if granting her a favor. "This time, try to stay on your feet for a few seconds, huh?" They reset. Again, Eleanor reached for his GI. This time, her movements were slightly less hesitant. She tried to remember a basic break fall, a simple technique to control her landing, but the memory was fuzzy. She tried to circle him, to move to his side, but he was too quick, too athletic. He would simply pivot, his body always between her and any possible escape. It was a dance, but a cruel one. He was the dancer, and she was the clumsy partner. Constantly tripping over her own feet, she tried to get a hold of his arm, to use it as a lever, but he simply shook her off as if she were a fly. She tried to push his hips to create some space, but it was like pushing against a brick wall. He was toying with her, using just enough strength to frustrate her efforts, but not so much that he looked like a bully. He was clever in his cruelty, making it all look like an innocent game. Every time she failed, his friends would chuckle. And every time she failed, a little more of Eleanor's confidence chipped away. And yet, beneath the frustration, something was beginning to change. Eleanor was no longer just trying to push and pull. The initial panic and embarrassment were being replaced by a strange, cold focus. She stopped trying to win. She stopped trying to score. She started to study. With every failed attempt, with every humiliating tumble to the mat, she was gathering information. She was learning. She learned that when he went to push her, he put a little too much weight on his lead foot. She learned that when he laughed, his posture slackened for a fraction of a second. She learned that his favorite move was a simple hip throw. He telegraphed it by dropping his left shoulder just before he committed. He was an open book, and his pages were filled with arrogance. She had a brief flash of memory. A sun-drenched afternoon in a small dojo in Japan, a long time ago. Her husband's voice, calm and patient. "Do not fight their strength, my love. It is a river, and you are a rock. The river will always win. Instead, be the water. Flow with the river. Go where it wants you to go, and then, when it is not looking, find a small path and change its course." The words were like a key turning in a rusted lock. Her mind, which had been a tangled mess of anxiety, began to clear. She was no longer fighting Mark. She was letting him win. She was letting him think he was in complete control. She let him pin her. She let him escape her holds. She let him mock her. And with every moment he spent demonstrating his dominance, he was also showing her his weaknesses. The final straw came during his last, most contemptuous takedown attempt. He had pinned her again, his friends now openly watching, their phones out, recording the funny old lady. "One more time, Grandma?" Mark called out, his voice booming with confidence. "Show me your best move." He disengaged from her and stood up, pulling her to her feet in one smooth, effortless motion. He was putting on a grand finale. He wanted a spectacular takedown to end the performance. He stepped back, giving her some space. "Come on, try to tackle me," he taunted. Give it your best shot." Eleanor stood there for a moment, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The flush of embarrassment was gone from her face, replaced by a look of absolute calm. Her pale blue eyes were no longer clouded with age and uncertainty. They were clear, sharp, and focused entirely on Mark. He didn't see the change. He was too busy looking at his friends, too busy enjoying his moment in the spotlight. He took a running start, a showy, unnecessary bit of flair. He lunged forward, aiming to wrap his arms around her waist for a big theatrical body slam, and in that moment, as he launched himself towards her, everything went quiet. The laughter, the whispers, the sounds of the other students, all of it faded away. There was only Mark, and there was Eleanor. She saw his telegraphed move, the overcommitted lunge, the shift of his weight onto his front foot, the wide-open space on his side. The rusted lock in her mind clicked open. The ghost stories were no longer vague. They were crystal clear, and she was ready. The world seemed to slow down into a series of crystal clear pictures. There was Mark, a picture of pure forward motion. His arms were outstretched like a cartoon villain, his face a mask of smug triumph. He was flying towards her, a large, unstoppable object, convinced of his own victory. There was the look on his friends' faces, a mixture of glee and anticipation, their phones held up like offerings to a god of cheap thrills. There was Sensei Mike, a few feet away, his face a canvas of concern. His body already moving to intervene, but he was too late, caught in the slowness of the moment. And then there was Eleanor. She was not a rock about to be smashed by the river. She was the water her body, which had been stiff and awkward just seconds before, suddenly moved with a purpose that was both shocking and beautiful. She did not step back. She did not try to brace herself. She did the one thing Mark's confident, arrogant brain would never have expected. She stepped into his path, not to meet his force, but to join it. As his massive body made contact with hers, she dropped her own center of gravity, bending her knees slightly. She let his momentum wash over her, not as a destructive wave, but as a current to be guided. Her hands, which had been so weak and clumsy, now moved with the speed and precision of a master artisan. One hand went to his hip, the other to the back of his collar. It wasn't a push or a pull. It was a connection, a point of contact that allowed her to feel his balance, his weight, his trajectory. And then she turned. It was not a big, powerful movement. It was small, efficient, and economical. She pivoted on the ball of her foot, turning her body just enough to create a void where she had been a moment before. At the exact same time, she used his own forward momentum against him, guiding his weight across her body with her hands and hips. The physics of it were simple, elegant, and absolute. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. Mark was in motion. He just didn't expect his motion to be redirected so completely and so suddenly. His feet left the floor. He was airborne. For a split second, the look on his face changed from smug confidence to pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes widened. His mouth fell open. The entire trajectory of his lunge was altered. He was no longer heading towards Eleanor. He was heading towards the mat, his body flying through the air in a perfect, arcing arc that seemed to defy the clumsy power he'd put into the attack. He landed with a sound that no one in the dojo would ever forget. It wasn't a thud. It wasn't a slap. It was a deep, resonant whump, like a heavy sack of potatoes being dropped from a great height onto a wooden floor. The sound was so final, so absolute, that it sucked all the air out of the room. Mark's impact was solid and heavy, and the air was forced from his lungs in a loud involuntary gasp. He lay flat on his back on the mat, his eyes wide and staring blankly at the high ceiling, his chest rising and falling in short panicked breaths. His mind was a complete blank. He had no idea what had just happened. One moment he was soaring, the king of the world, the next he was a crumpled, breathless heap on the floor. The entire dojo was frozen in place. The only sound was Mark's ragged breathing. The students who had been rolling nearby had stopped dead in their tracks, their mouths agape. The ones who had been watching from the sidelines were completely still, their phones forgotten in their hands. Mark's friends stood, as if they had been turned to stone, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Their fun was over. Their show had been hijacked, and the star of their show had just been taken down by a woman they had been mocking for the last half hour. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every other sound. Eleanor moved before anyone else could even process what they had just seen. There was no pause, no moment of self-congratulation. The technique had been instinctual, a muscle memory that had been asleep for decades, but had woken up with a vengeance. Her training, the deep-seated principles that her husband had drilled into her for years, took over. In Jiu-Jitsu, you never leave an opponent on the ground. You always establish control. Her body flowed into the next position as naturally as a river finding its path to the sea. In one fluid motion, she dropped to her knees beside the stunned Mark, her weight settling onto his torso. She was not heavy, but her position was perfect. Her center of gravity was low. Her balance was unshakable. She was in a dominant position, the mount and Mark, with his lungs burning and his mind reeling, was as helpless as a turtle flipped onto its shell. It was at this precise, silent and shocking moment that James, a senior student and a lean, respected black belt, finally reached them. He had been watching the whole exchange with growing alarm. He had seen Mark's cocky disrespect, and he had seen Eleanor's quiet focus. When Mark had launched himself, James had started to move, intending to put a stop to the nonsense before someone got hurt. But he, like everyone else, had been completely unprepared for what happened next. He saw the flawless trip, the perfect use of momentum, the solid landing. He saw the masterclass in a single, breathtaking moment. And now he saw this tiny, elderly woman in a full mount over a man twice her size. His mind, trained for years to analyze technique, was struggling to catch up. His first instinct, born of a sense of responsibility and the desire to protect, was to intervene. He didn't see a technique. He saw a young man on the ground and an elderly woman in a dominant, potentially dangerous position. He didn't know Eleanor. He didn't know her skill level. He only saw the potential for things to go wrong. He reached out a hand, not to grab her, but to touch her shoulder gently, to create a point of contact and de-escalate the situation. "Hey, easy now," he said, his voice calm and steady, trying to bring a sense of order back to the chaos. "That's enough. Let's just take a breath." But to Eleanor, whose senses were heightened and whose body was operating on pure instinct, this was a new threat. Her world had narrowed to the person beneath her and the immediate space around her. She felt the shift in the air, the new presence. She saw the hand coming towards her from the corner of her eye. She didn't see a helpful senior student. She saw an opponent. She saw a new attack. Her body reacted without thought. The principles were the same. Use their energy. Use their momentum. The hand was coming forward. James was stepping in. He was giving her his weight, his balance, in a movement so fast it was almost a blur. Eleanor shifted her weight just a fraction. Her right hand, which had been resting on Mark's chest, snaked out with the speed of a striking cobra. It wasn't a grab. It was a catch. She caught James's outstretched wrist at the exact moment it was about to touch her shoulder. At the same time, her left leg pivoted, swinging across his body as he stepped in, hooking behind his knee. Her hips drove forward and up off Mark's chest in a powerful, explosive movement. James, a black belt, a man who had spent years training to defend against attacks, had no time to react. The technique was too fast, too perfect, too unexpected. His arm was caught. His leg was hooked. His body was being pulled forward and down. He tried to pull back, to plant his feet, but Eleanor's leverage was perfect. She had already stolen his balance. He was falling. He tried to roll with it to break his fall, but the arm lock was already being applied. Eleanor, now on her feet, turned her body, keeping her hips low, and extended her arms. Putting all the pressure on his elbow joint, pain, sharp and immediate, shot up James's arm. It was a clean, technical, and inescapable hold. He had no choice. He had trained for this moment his entire life. He didn't hesitate. His other hand slapped the mat hard, once, twice. The sound of his tap echoed in the tomb's silent dojo, a signal of surrender that was as clear as a shout. Tap. Tap. As soon as the tap registered, Eleanor's body seemed to deflate. The intense, focused energy that had animated her just a second ago vanished like a puff of smoke. She let go of James's arm instantly, her fingers uncurling from his wrist. She stumbled back a step, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at her own hands, turning them over and over as if they were foreign objects, as if they belonged to someone else. They were trembling violently. A wave of something washed over her, a dizzying, disorienting mix of shock, adrenaline, and a profound, terrifying sense of loss. She had just taken down 2 men, one of them a black belt, in the space of 10 seconds, and she hadn't even thought about it. James was on his knees, clutching his elbow, not in agony, but in awe. He was looking at Eleanor, his face a perfect picture of disbelief. The other students were staring, their minds trying to process what they had just witnessed. The grandmothers, the old ladies they saw in the grocery store, the people they underestimated and dismissed, none of them could do this. It was like watching a swan suddenly pull out a sword and challenge a knight to a duel. It broke every rule in their book. The air was thick with the unsaid question, a question that hung over the entire dojo, palpable and overwhelming. Who was this woman? And what, in the name of God, had they just been mocking? The silence that followed the 2 sharp taps on the mat was deeper and more profound than the one that had followed Mark's fall. It was a silence filled with a sudden, dawning understanding, a collective gasp of awe and confusion. Mark was still on the floor, but now he had pushed himself up onto his elbows. His face, which had been a mask of confident arrogance just moments before, was now slack with pure, unadulterated shock. He was staring at Eleanor, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were looking at a ghost. His friends, who had been a pack of loud, jeering hyenas just before, were now completely silent. Their phones were still in their hands, but they were no longer recording a joke. They were capturing a miracle, or perhaps their own public humiliation. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of this silent storm, her body trembling. The adrenaline that had fueled those lightning-fast movements was now draining away, leaving her feeling cold, hollow, and profoundly exposed. She looked at her own hands again. The hands that had so effortlessly moved a man twice her size, and then, a second later, locked the arm of a black belt. They felt alien to her. They were the hands of a stranger, a powerful stranger whose body she had temporarily inhabited. The reality of what she had done began to crash down on her, not as a triumphant wave, but as a terrifying tide. She had lost control. The part of her she kept locked away, the part that belonged to a different life with a different man, had broken free. James, the black belt, was the first to move. He slowly and carefully rose to his feet, gingerly testing his elbow. There was no real damage, only the sharp, lingering memory of the perfectly applied pressure. He didn't look angry or offended. He looked humbled. Utterly and completely humbled. He took a step towards Eleanor, his movements slow and non-threatening. He held his hands up slightly, palms open, a universal sign for "I'm not a threat." "Ma'am," he began, his voice soft and filled with a reverence that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. What was that?" "I have been training for 15 years, and I have never been caught so cleanly. I have never even seen that setup before." He wasn't questioning her. He was genuinely asking. It's like a student asking a master to explain an impossible equation. Eleanor flinched at his words, as if he had struck her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, defensive gesture. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "It just happened." Her eyes were wide and filled with a deep, unsettling fear. She looked around the room, at all the faces staring at her, and for a moment she looked like a cornered animal. She wanted to run. It was then that Sensei Mike finally reached the center of the storm. He had watched the entire sequence, and his face was a complex tapestry of emotions. There was shock, of course, but there was also pride, a deep, abiding pride that seemed to radiate from him. He gently took Eleanor by the elbow, his touch light but firm, grounding her. He turned to James and gave him a small, respectful nod. Then, he turned to face the entire class, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "The lesson is over," he announced, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority that no one dared question. "Everyone, please, bow out. Line up." The students moved quickly and quietly, their movements stripped of their usual casual energy. They formed two neat lines, facing the center of the mat. But their attention was entirely focused on the small, elderly woman standing next to their instructor. Mark and his friends scurried to the back of the line, trying to make themselves invisible, their smugness completely gone, replaced by a deep, burning shame. Sensei Mike led Eleanor to the front of the room, standing her beside him. He looked at his students, his gaze sweeping over every single face, lingering on the young men who had been so disrespectful moments before. "This is Jiu-Jitsu," he said, his voice low and serious. "It is not about being the strongest person in the room. It is not about being the biggest or the fastest. It is the art of the gentle way. It is the art of the weak, defeating the strong through leverage, through technique, and most of all, through a focused mind. Today," he said, gesturing towards Eleanor, "you have all just received a masterclass in its purest form. You have all just been humbled by a true master." The word master hung in the air. It seemed impossible, absurd. This woman, who had struggled to do a simple hip rotation, who looked like a gust of wind could knock her over, a master? But as they looked at her, they started to see her differently. They looked past the stooped shoulders, the wrinkles, the white hair. They saw the focused look in her eyes that was still there, a faint echo of the power that had been unleashed. They saw the truth in their instructor's words. Sensei Mike's gaze became stern. "And for those of you who thought this was a joke," he said, his voice hardening, "who thought it was funny to mock a fellow student, you have received a more important lesson. You have learned a lesson in respect. You have learned that strength without humility is just arrogance, and arrogance is a weakness that a true artist can exploit in an instant." He didn't need to call anyone out by name. The young men in the back of the line visibly shrank, their faces glowing with shame. They understood. They all understood. They had been shown up, not by someone stronger, but by someone they had deemed insignificant. Eleanor stood beside him, her hands still trembling, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. This attention was worse than the mockery she could ignore. This was a spotlight on a part of her she had kept hidden for a decade. It felt like a violation. She felt a single hot tear slide down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, hoping no one saw. Sensei Mike must have felt her distress. He softened his tone and turned back to her, his voice gentle once more. "Eleanor, I am sorry. I should not have put you on the spot. But I want you to know what you did. It was beautiful. It was a testament to a lifetime of practice. Do you mind if I ask? Who taught you?" The question, asked with such genuine respect, broke through the wall of her fear. She looked at Sensei Mike, at his kind, encouraging face. She thought of her husband David. She thought of the long, happy years they had spent on the mat together, the sound of his laughter, the feeling of his rough, calloused hand in hers. She had come here looking for a memory, and instead she had unleashed a ghost. The ghost was her own. It was time to stop running from it. She took a shaky breath. "My husband," she said, her voice a little stronger now, but still thick with emotion. "David, he was a second-degree black belt. We trained together for many, many years." She looked down at her hands again, but this time it wasn't with fear. It was with a wistful, sad fondness. "We learned in Japan when we were first married. We had a small dojo there, just a little room in a quiet neighborhood. He always said that jiu-jitsu wasn't something you do. It's something you are. It becomes a part of you." Quiet murmur went through the students. It all started to make sense. The strange familiarity in her movements, the way her body seemed to remember things her mind had forgotten. It was all there, a deep-seated foundation that had just been buried under the dust of time and grief. "We trained almost every day," Eleanor continued, her voice growing a little more confident as she spoke of her past. Even after we came back home, even after the kids were born. It was our thing, our language. She paused, and another tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine lines on her cheek. She didn't wipe this one away. He passed away 10 years ago. A heart attack. Very sudden. Her voice cracked on the last few words, the raw pain of the loss still fresh, even after a decade. I haven't been on a mat since. Not once. It hurt too much. Everything about it reminded me of him. Coming here today, I don't know why. I felt like I needed to. I needed to feel close to him again. There was not a single sound in the dojo. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. The young men in the back were no longer smiling. They were standing with their heads bowed, their faces filled with a profound and crushing guilt. They had been mocking her grief. They had been laughing at her attempt to honor the memory of the man she had loved. Mark, in particular, looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He had not only been defeated physically, he had been exposed as a cruel, immature boy. James, the black belt, was staring at Eleanor with an expression of deep, heartfelt respect. He understood now. It wasn't just a technique he had fallen to. He had fallen to decades of shared love and practice. He had been tapped out by a ghost, but a ghost powered by love. He took a step forward and bowed a deep, formal bow from the waist, a gesture of ultimate respect. "Sensei David," he said quietly, as if speaking to the memory itself. "He taught you well." One by one, the other students followed his lead, bowing their heads in a silent, shared moment of respect for a man they had never met and for the woman who had carried his legacy so beautifully, even when she didn't know it. The air was no longer tense with shock or shame. It was thick with a powerful shared emotion. It was the feeling of a community coming together, the lesson being learned not through instruction, but through experience. Sensei Mike placed a comforting hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Eleanor. Thank you for honoring him today. I think you made him very proud." Eleanor looked up at him, and for the first time since she had walked into the dojo, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, watery smile, but it was real. The fear was still there, humming just beneath the surface, but something else had taken its place. A feeling of peace. She hadn't just remembered her husband. She had felt his spirit flow through her. She had reclaimed a piece of herself that she thought was gone forever. The mocking had been the spark, but the love had been the fire. And in that moment, standing in the center of a silent, respectful room, she knew she had finally come home. The bow was held for a long, silent moment. It was a shared breath, a collective acknowledgement of the story they had all just witnessed. When the students slowly straightened up, the atmosphere in the dojo had been permanently transformed. The air, once thick with arrogance and testosterone, was now clear and calm, charged with a new, deeper kind of respect. The young men who had been a loud, disruptive pack were now subdued, their shoulders slumped, their eyes fixed on the mats beneath their feet. They were no longer the kings of the room. They were students, humbled and quiet. Sensei Mike dismissed the class, his voice soft. "Everyone take some time to stretch. Reflect on today's lesson. No need to rush." The students moved slowly, their movements lacking their usual urgency. Instead of grabbing their bags and heading for the door, many of them lingered, their eyes still drawn to Eleanor. There was no more mockery, no more quiet whispers. There was only a reverent curiosity. Mark was the first to break away from his friends. He walked slowly, as if his legs were made of lead, towards the front of the room where Eleanor was standing, still looking a little lost. He stopped a few feet away from her, not daring to come closer. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the floor. His friends watched from a distance, their own expressions a mixture of guilt and awe. They were waiting to see what would happen, to see how she would treat their leader, now that the power dynamic had been so violently and completely inverted. Eleanor saw him approach. She felt a familiar flicker of anxiety, the old fear of being judged, of being found wanting, but it was different this time. It was weaker. She took a small, steadying breath, the way David had taught her to do before a difficult sparring session. "Center yourself. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Be present. Mark finally looked up, and the look on his face was a raw, unguarded portrait of shame. His eyes were red, his cheeks were flushed. He wasn't the cocky athlete anymore. He was just a young man who had been profoundly and publicly humbled, and who had realized in the same moment that he had been cruel. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words catching in his throat. He took another step closer, and then did something that no one in the room expected. He dropped to his knees and placed his forehead on the mat. It was a gesture of deep, abject apology, complete and total surrender of his pride. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice muffled by the mat, but thick with sincerity. "I was disrespectful. I was a fool. Please, forgive me." The room went completely still. No one breathed. Eleanor stared at the bowed head of the young man who had just minutes before been treating her like a joke. She felt no surge of triumph, no desire to gloat. She felt only a wave of profound, sad empathy. He was just a boy full of insecurity that he hid behind a mask of strength. She knew the type. David had been a master at seeing through such masks. She slowly knelt down on the mats in front of him, her movements stiff but purposeful. She didn't tell him to get up. She simply waited. After a moment, he slowly lifted his head, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He met her gaze, and she saw no arrogance there, only a desperate need for absolution. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We are all here to learn. I was just as nervous as you were, my body. It doesn't always do what my mind wants anymore." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Your strength is a gift. The lesson is in how you choose to use it." Her words were not a reprimand, but an offering. She was not his superior. She was a fellow traveler on the same path. It was the most profound lesson he could have learned. Mark nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. He just looked at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. He finally pushed himself to his feet, and he held out a hand to help her up. This time, when she took it, his grip was gentle, respectful. He helped her to her feet, and then took a step back, giving a small, formal bow. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. "That was a lesson I will never forget." From that day on, the dojo was a different place. Eleanor became a permanent fixture. She bought her own white GI, and Sensei Mike gave her a white belt, which she tied around her waist with a trembling pride. She wasn't the fast student. She still struggled with the warm-ups, her body often protesting loudly. But her mind was sharp, and her understanding of the principles was deeper than anyone's. She started to stay after the main class, working with a few of the older students who were inspired by her. And then, one day, Mark approached her after a class. "Ma'am," he asked, his voice still holding a note of deference. "I was wondering, could you show me that thing you did? That trip?" He looked down at the mat, a little embarrassed to be asking. I've been trying to figure it out, and I can't." Eleanor looked at him, then at the empty space on the mat. A genuine smile spread across her face. "David called it using the gate against the horse," she said, her voice warm with memory. "He said, you never meet force with force. You just open the gate and let the horse run right through." She spent the next 20 minutes with Mark, her movements slow and deliberate as she explained the principles of balance and leverage. Mark listened with an intensity he had never shown in class before. He wasn't just learning a technique. He was learning a philosophy. The final scene weeks later was not one of dramatic takedowns, but of quiet, communal learning. Eleanor was sitting on a bench on the side of the mat, demonstrating a hold on Mark's arm. A small group of students, including a few of the original group of young men, had gathered around to listen. Her hands, no longer trembling, moved with a slow, sure grace as she explained how a small shift in the hips could change an entire dynamic. Mark, now humbled and genuinely eager to learn, watched her every move with rapt attention. She had not come to the dojo to become a master or to prove her strength. She had come looking for a ghost, for a memory of the man she had lost. But in that search she had found so much more. She had found a community. She had found a new purpose in passing on the knowledge her husband had so loved. And she had helped a group of young men learn that the strongest fighter is not the one with the loudest laugh or the biggest muscles, but the one with the quietest mind and the most respectful heart. The elderly woman they had mocked had become their quiet, unassuming sensei, and in doing so she had honored her husband's memory in the most beautiful way possible. She had turned a place of pain into a place of peace, and in the process had taught them all what it truly meant to be strong.